This is about inflation. The CPI data came in unlike what was expected, causing strong market reactions. Higher interest rate usually leads to more investment in bonds, lower investment in stocks. Inflation is thought to have broadened. Consumer Price Index increased 0.1%. Prices climbs 8.3%. If personal income falls behind inflation, the earning is effectively less. This presentation is about the actual numerical figure of the inflation, viewed in a broader context. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics compile a list of goods and services, and estimate their relative weights for a consumer. There are 8 categories, each with a relative weight. The 3 largest are housing, transportation, and food. Because of a recent drop of the gas price, which is of the transportation category, there is an expectation of a substantial decrease in inflation. However, transportation counts only 18%, and fuel is just a part of that. Perhaps there is an over-expectation. First, let's take a general look at the CPI. This chart is the historical CPI from 1947 until August 2022. This is how the so-called real dollar, or specific year dollar is calculated. For example, $1,000 in 1972, would have an equivalent consumer purchasing power of $7,055 in 2022. Likewise, $1,000 in 2022, is only equal to 142 of the 1972 dollar. Let's take a close-up look at the CPI in more recent time. First, it appears that it should have been a welcome news, as August 2022 CPI is practically the same as that of July, merely 0.1% higher. It is like something used to cost $10, now costs $10 and 1 extra cent. Is that a shocking price increase? The CPI, after several months climbing, has plateaued for 3 straight months, June, July, August. If anything, that should have brought some cheers or at least some optimism. Second, the CPI has been steadily increasing with a steep slope since the beginning of 2021. It is puzzling why all of a sudden, news about inflation flared up only in the late spring of 2022. This is a common phenomenon. Public perception and buzzes may exceed true substance and reality. 0.1% may be within random fluctuation, and 8.3% inflation, a number, taken out of context, may not be meaningful. Inflation, as a concept, is simply the increase of the prices of things we need for living. 2 common formulas to calculate inflation are, 1, month-to-month increase, and 2, year-to-year increase. For month-to-month increase, it is the difference between 2 successive month CPIs, divided by the earlier month CPI. For August 2022, that formula yields 0.1%, which is like 1 cent increase to $10. For that, all 3 major market indices dropped. A reason is the over-expectation of a somewhat unrealistic actual CPI decline, and also, the year-to-year inflation figure. First, consider the 0.1% figure of monthly increase. This is the monthly increase of CPI of 75 years, from 1947 to 2022. Its statistical distribution is a typical double-sided Laplace distribution function. A 0.1% is even less than the 75-year average, which is mu, 0.2% as shown. In other words, the monthly inflation of August 2022 is very tamed in the inflation 75-year history. It was arguably newsworthy in May 2022, as the monthly rise was higher than 95% of all monthly inflations on record. But this is no longer the case for July and August. Perhaps the decline from June to July, minus 0.02%, which is also statistically insignificant, had brought the over-expectation of a sharp decline, or a deflation. Large deflation is very rare in its history. There is one chance in 25 that there is a monthly increase of 1%, but only 1 in 907 to have a decline of 1%. That one time in 907 months of inflation history, a deflation of 1.8%, was November 2008. It came at an enormous social cost that all economists know, the largest unemployment rise in the 70-year US history, not including the COVID-19 pandemic. Given this economic gospel of the trade-off between inflation versus unemployment, it was rather puzzling to see widespread expectations, or wishful thinking, of any substantial deflation amidst one of the hottest job markets in the last decade. The second numerical figure of inflation, also the most confusing, is the so-called year-to-year, or 12-month rise of the CPI. For this metric, the CPI data are partitioned into yearly 12-month data block. The 12-month block of each year can be vertically aligned and plotted on top of each other. The idea is that each month of a given year is to be compared with the same month of the previous year. For example, May 2022 is to be compared with May 2021, which, in turn, is compared to May 2020. Then, the fractional change of each month, relative to the same month of the previous year, is calculated. For example, shown is the formula for May 2022 inflation relative to 12-month earlier. Note that the left chart was plotted on a reduced range, so as the CPI differences between the years can be seen clearly. The actual year-to-year fractional changes are less than 10%, as can be seen in a plot with the full CPI magnitude range in the center. The bar chart on the rightmost is another graphic presentation for the year-to-year comparison. The chart shows the year-to-year inflation rate. Note that the chart has certain features, such as valley and bump, yet they can be arbitrary and have no significance. In May 2020, the year-to-year inflation is low because of the COVID-19 recession. Then, for the same reason, inflation of May 2021 has an abnormally high bump, only because it happens to be compared to the COVID-19 CPI drop just for that one episode. Hence, the sudden rise of the year-to-year inflation of May 2021 is a coincidental artifact that has no significance. Consider this analogy. An airplane uses a primitive altimeter, which measures the altitude as the distance to the ground surface with a radar beam, as shown at position A. When the airplane flies over a deep canyon, as shown in position B, the altimeter records a large altitude. And eventually it flies past the canyon in position C. A person looks at the airplane altitude chart may wonder why it suddenly flew higher between the hours of 6:00 and 7:00. The question already has built-in misleading impression that can hinder proper data analysis. Just like someone who knows nothing of the COVID-19 economic effect, might wonder what happens just before May 2021 that causes such a bump on inflation. The problem is that the metric that is so-called year-to-year inflation, is misleading and not useful. This approach of comparing one season of a year, with the same season of the previous year, is often applied to phenomena with strong seasonal effects. For example, retail sales and food services. It is very evident that the retail sales and food services are highly seasonal, as the same pattern repeats years and years. There is a spike in between December and January, a deep decrease in January-February, and a few bumps during spring, summer, fall, correspondent to the various social-cultural activities. For this, it makes sense to compare the sales of one month of one year with that same month of the previous year. But this does not apply to inflation, which is not seasonal. How do we know some data is seasonal or not? The common technique is Fourier analysis, shown here as an example. Consider retail and food services data. Applying 12-month moving average results in the baseline curve. The difference between the raw data and the baseline is the residual, which displays very pronounced seasonal effects that are periodic annually. Applying Fourier transform, one can obtain its Fourier spectrum, which shows distinctive peaks with specific frequencies, once a year, twice a year and so on. From these distinctive Fourier component peaks, the season pattern can be mathematically reconstructed, also known as Fourier synthesis, producing the seasonal curve. From the curve, it shows that retail and food spending is highest between late December, early January, lowest in mid-February, and has ups and downs in certain times of the year. This is an example of data with pronounced seasonal effects. Apply the same analysis to the consumer price index. There is no evidence of pronounced periodic seasonal effects. The Fourier spectrum has no dominant peaks. Consider the three highest. There are something that occur once every 10.5 months, every 16.8 months, or every 9.3 months. These are not statistically significant, and are no different from randomly generated time series. Thus, applying seasonal concept to CPI and inflation is not meaningful. The reason for the 12-month year-to-year comparison is purely for the human communication purpose. It gives one a rough gut feeling of how much one has to pay more from a year ago, but this metric is not for data analysis. Back to our main discussion. In another presentation, it is shown that there is a strong correlation between the monetary supply M2 and inflation. In other words, if there is too much money freely available to chase goods and services, the prices will go up, which is inflation. In spring 2020, the US had the largest single dose of M2 quantitative easing in history, intended to avert the COVID-19 recession, which actually caused a brief deflation. There is a time delay effect between M2 and inflation, like the time it takes for, say, winter snow in the mountains to melt and flow down into the rivers in the spring, causing flash flood, like M2 injection will eventually cause inflation. Analysis shows that this time delay is approximately 1.5 to 2 years, and the summer 2022 inflation is the peak of the effect. In an optimistic scenario, the inflation of summer 2022 will taper off to the long-term mean inflation by the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. The following are related topics to inflation. The most relevant that the stock markets are most concerned with is the interest rate. 2022 inflation is often compared to that of the late 80s, early 90s. As it can be seen, the interest rate, as represented by the yield of the U.S. Treasury 10-year note, back then, was also the highest in over 60 years. The prime rate, set by the Fed, of course, was a governance policy to combat inflation. The high interest rate tends to follow a rise in inflation due to the Fed policy. Subsequently, the inflation tends to decline. The inflation back then was so high, and the Fed was so obsessive in fighting it, that there was a legend of an inflation as high as 50% on some service. Bill Clinton recounted that Alan Greenspan, when arriving for the White House dinner, gave a tip of 75 cents to the coat valet. He chuckled and mumbled how high inflation was, because, he said, last year, he gave only 50 cents. The second important topic related to inflation is unemployment. The latter inextricably related to recession, which is covered in this video. The video includes a quantitative analysis of the gross domestic product, or GDP, the employment level, that is the worker population, and worker productivity. It also shows an example of machine learning applied to classify recession based on the pattern of unemployment and GDP. What price should be paid to combat inflation? There is a strong, inextricable correlation between unemployment and inflation. There is a sharp inflation decrease for every major rise in unemployment. The reason is simple. Unemployment happens when business are not doing well, when the economy is having a downturn, or recession. The vertical bars mark recession episodes as determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The other video shows that with just the rising edge data of the unemployment rate as shown here. Basic classification algorithms of machine learning, from as simple as nearest neighbor, to neural network, all are perfect in correctly identifying an episode as a recession. In other words, the hallmark signature of a recession is a sharp and sustained rise in unemployment, which is also correlated to a drop in GDP. With unemployment comes mortgage delinquency, credit card default. For business, it is loan delinquency. Then, with consumers having less money, inflation will be tamed. In fact, as mentioned previously, the largest deflation on the record was the 1.8% monthly drop during the 2008 financial crisis. The question is this worth the price to fight inflation?